When a simple waitress breaks the rules out of compassion, she sets off a domino effect that can transform lives, even that of someone who never imagined being touched by it. Fairtixu, the aroma of second chances. The aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the cozy atmosphere of Mitchell Coffee and Company on the busiest corner of Boston's financial district. It was early afternoon, and the mild autumn sun streamed through the large glass windows, illuminating the dark wooden tables where executives, students, and retirees sought a moment of respite. Lucy Reed adjusted the black apron with the coffee shop's golden logo and took a deep breath before approaching a new table. She was 32, with brown hair pulled back in a discreet bun and a restrained smile that rarely revealed her thoughts. She had worked there for almost 2 years and knew every detail of the place, every creak of the floorboards, every mark on the porcelain cups, every story of the regular customers. "Good afternoon. What would you like today?" she asked in her gentle voice, positioning her order pad between her well-maintained but unpolished fingernails. The grey-haired gentleman looked up from the newspaper he was reading. "Ah, Lucy. The usual, please. That freshly brewed coffee with a slice of that cinnamon cake that only you folks know how to make. With or without the caramel sauce, Mr. August?" Lucy already knew the answer but liked to ask. It was her way of showing she cared about the details. "With the sauce, of course. My doctor will have to forgive me. But a little sweetness now and then doesn't hurt, does it?" She smiled slightly and wrote down the order, even though it wasn't necessary. The ritual was important, both for the customer and for her. It was in these small gestures that Lucy found some stability, something her personal life hadn't offered her for a long time. In the kitchen, she handed over the order and exchanged a few words with Ms. Zelda, the pastry chef who had worked for the chain since its opening, 15 years ago. While waiting for the order to be ready, she observed the new employee washing dishes in the farthest corner. Edward was his name from what she remembered. A middle-aged man, quiet, who had started a few days ago as a kitchen assistant. There was something curious about him. He didn't seem to be accustomed to manual labor. His hands had recent calluses, and sometimes she caught him observing the kitchen procedures with an interest that went beyond the simple execution of tasks. But Lucy wasn't one to ask questions. She knew well that everyone had the right to their own secrets. "Mr. Edward, when you're done with those pots, can you help me organize the grain stock?" asked Marcy, the unit manager, an efficient woman with short hair and a stern gaze. "The special coffee shipment from Vermont just arrived." "Yes, ma'am. I'm just finishing up here," Edward replied, with a deference that sounded slightly forced. What no one there knew, not even Marcy, who prided herself on keeping everything under control, was that Edward Mitchell was not a simple kitchen assistant. He was the founder and owner of the Mitchell Coffee and Company chain, which had 15 locations throughout Massachusetts and New York. At 48, after receiving increasingly disconnected reports about the reality of his stores, he decided to immerse himself in the daily life of one of them without revealing his identity. He chose the financial district unit because it was one of the oldest and most emblematic. He forged basic documents, invented a past as a worker in small diners, and presented himself as just another middle-aged man looking for a job. Marcy barely glanced at his resume before hiring him for the most basic position available. During the first 2 weeks, Edward observed, learned, and was surprised. There was an enormous difference between the reports he received in his office on the 10th floor of a commercial building and day-to-day reality. The small dissatisfactions of customers that never reached his ears, the waste of supplies that the reports didn't capture, the power dynamics among employees that no spreadsheet could translate. And, above all, there was Lucy, an employee who didn't stand out in the numbers, who didn't sell more than others, who didn't appear on the month's highlight lists, but who carried with her a quality that Edward couldn't name, a discreet presence that somehow seemed to be the true heart of that coffee shop. The day progressed with the usual routine. The movement increased around 5 in the afternoon, when executives from nearby offices stopped by for coffee before facing the traffic. Lucy attended table after table with the same serene attention for each customer. Edward, from the kitchen, observed her through the small service window. At 7 in the evening, a light rain began to fall over Boston. The sky darkened quickly, and the amber lights of the coffee shop created an even cozier environment. Some customers remained, protected from the weather, while others left hurriedly under umbrellas. It was then that Edward noticed something strange in Lucy's behavior. She looked repeatedly at the window, with an expression that mixed concern and expectation. With each new customer who entered, her eyes quickly verified who it was, only to return to her usual composure. At 8:30, only 2 customers remained in the salon. The coffee shop would close at 9. Edward had already finished cleaning the pots and was helping Miss Zelda store the last desserts in the refrigerator. That's when he heard the bell of the main door announcing a new customer. Instinctively, he looked through the service window. It wasn't an ordinary customer. It was a small girl soaked by the rain, with dark hair stuck to her face and an expression of someone carrying worries too big for her age. She must have been 8 or 9 years old, wore a coat too thin for the cold weather, and held a plastic bag against her chest. What impressed Edward most was Lucy's reaction. Her face transformed completely. The restrained smile gave way to an expression of genuine relief, as if she could finally breathe after hours of anxiety. She quickly grabbed a large napkin and approached the girl, speaking softly so that no one else would hear. "Beth, you're soaked. Come with me." The girl looked around, nervous about the presence of the last customers. "I can't stay here. Aunt Lucy," she whispered, her large, frightened eyes. "Just for a little while until the rain passes. Stay in the back room. I'll bring you something hot to drink." Edward retreated, pretending to busy himself with organizing the spices, but his ears were attentive. He saw when Lucy discreetly led the girl through a side door, away from the remaining customers' gaze. Minutes later, the waitress returned, served the last orders, and gently indicated that the coffee shop was about to close. The customers left. The rain increased. Marcy checked the cash register, gave the final instructions, and was the first to leave. Miss Zelda followed, protecting herself with a flowery umbrella. The other employees departed next, eager to get home. "Aren't you coming, Lucy?" asked Peter, the red-bearded barista who always closed the establishment with her. "I'm just going to organize some things in my locker. You can go, I'll lock up everything." Peter hesitated, looking at the heavy rain. "Are you sure?" "It's pouring out there, I'm sure." "I'll wait for it to ease up a bit." Peter shrugged and left. Edward, strategically, had left his jacket in the locker room. He waited for everyone to leave, counted to 20, and silently returned to retrieve what he had forgotten. As he approached the kitchen, he heard low voices coming from the small employee break room. The door was ajar. "Eat a little more, Beth. You need to eat properly." "I can't, Aunt Lucy. I'm worried about Jimmy." "Your brother is safe at Miss Maureen's house. She messaged me this morning. He's eating well, playing with her grandson." Edward froze in place. There was more to this story than he had imagined. He moved closer, trying not to make any noise. Through the crack in the door, he saw the girl wrapped in a clean towel sitting on the small sofa in the break room. Her hair was drier now, and she held a mug of hot chocolate between her small hands. Lucy was kneeling in front of her, with an expression of concern and affection that Edward had never seen on her face during her shift. "And when will we be able to stay together again, Aunt Lucy?" The girl's voice was almost a whisper, laden with a painful maturity. "Soon, Beth, I promise. I'm saving money to rent a bigger place where you two can stay with me. I just need a few more weeks. You won't give up on us, will you?" The question made Lucy swallow hard. She held the girl's face between her hands, with a gentleness that contrasted with the firmness of her voice. "Never, Bethany. I will never give up on you. We're going to be a family, I promise." Edward retreated silently. He had witnessed something he shouldn't have, something that completely changed his perception of Lucy Reed. As he discreetly exited through the back door, leaving his jacket behind, 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Who were these children, really? Why were they separated? And, mainly, what kind of story was behind that waitress with the restrained smile, who risked her job to protect an unknown girl? The rain fell mercilessly on Edward as he walked to his car, parked 3 blocks away. He was no longer just the disguised owner seeking insights for his business. He was a man confronted with a reality that his spreadsheets and reports could never capture. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. Edward didn't sleep well that night. The images of Lucy with the girl Bethany repeated in his mind like a film on loop. The Successful businessman, accustomed to making cold decisions based on numbers and projections, felt strangely touched by that intimate scene of care and protection. The next morning, he arrived earlier at the coffee shop. The rain had stopped, leaving clean air and a cobalt blue sky over Boston. He found Marcy already organizing the tables, positioning the day's menus with special offers. "Good morning, Edward." "You're early today," she commented, without taking her eyes off the task. "I thought I'd get ahead on some stock work," he replied, trying to sound casual. "Great. Take the opportunity to check if the new paper filters arrived. They should be in the box marked utensils." He nodded and headed to the storage area, but his mind was far from there. While organizing coffee packages and counting filters, he formulated questions he needed to answer. Who was Lucy Reed, really? What was her relationship with that child? And how did a waitress plan to support 2 children on the salary that the Mitchell chain paid? The day progressed, and Lucy arrived punctually for her shift as always. Nothing in her posture or behavior betrayed the events of the previous night. The same discreet bun, the same restrained smile, the same silent efficiency. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, Edward would never have suspected that this woman harbored such deep secrets. During the shift, he created small opportunities to observe her more closely. He offered to bring orders to her, asked about procedures even though he already knew the answers, positioned himself strategically in the kitchen to hear her conversations with customers. "Lucy, you're an angel," commented a white-haired lady who frequented the coffee shop every afternoon. "Only you remember that I like my jasmine tea with a pinch of cinnamon." "It's my job, Mrs. Cecilia," she replied, with that humility that Edward now realized was an integral part of her personality. "No, dear. Your job would be to serve the tea. Remembering the preferences of an old woman like me is kindness." Lucy smiled, one of those rare smiles that completely illuminated her face, and Edward felt something strange in his chest. This woman had a quality that couldn't be measured in performance reports or productivity evaluations. It was a genuine humanity, a capacity for connection that no corporate training could teach. At the end of the afternoon, Edward implemented the first part of his improvised plan. He asked Peter, the barista, to tell him more about the employees of the establishment. "I'm trying to fit in, you know. Get to know the staff better." Peter, always sociable, didn't hesitate to share. "Well, Marcy has been here for 8 years, started as a waitress, and today she's a manager. She has a strong temperament, but she's fair. Mrs. Elder is practically an institution, knows all the recipes by heart, and doesn't accept changes. For her, good coffee is traditional coffee. Carlos, who works on weekends, is saving money for engineering college." Edward listened attentively, waiting for Lucy's name to naturally arise. When Peter paused to prepare an espresso, he risked, "And Lucy?" "She seems quite reserved." Peter adjusted the pressure of the machine before answering. "Lucy is a mystery to everyone. She's worked here for almost 2 years, never misses a day, never complains. Does her job and goes home. Doesn't participate in get-togethers, doesn't talk about her personal life. She doesn't have family." Peter shrugged. "If she does, she's never mentioned it. Once I heard her talking on the phone about a certain Bethany. I thought it might be her daughter. But then she told Marcy that she doesn't have children." Edward felt a chill down his spine. The story was more complex than he had imagined. "But she's an excellent waitress," continued Peter, drawing a perfect leaf in the coffee foam. "The customers love her. She has a way of listening to people, you know, as if she really cared about what they have to say." That night, contrary to his good sense and all the privacy rules he defended as a businessman, Edward decided to follow Lucy after her shift. He maintained a safe distance as she boarded a bus on the main avenue. 20 minutes later, she got off in a simple neighborhood in the north of the city. Walking through narrow streets, Lucy finally entered a small and modest house, with a rusty iron gate and a poorly maintained small garden. Edward parked across the street and waited. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then a light turned on in what appeared to be the back porch. Lucy came out carrying bags and walked through a side alley to a second construction, possibly a small guest house or back house on the same property. Intrigued, Edward got out of the car and cautiously approached. The window of the small construction had thin curtains, which allowed a partial view of the dimly lit interior. What he saw made his heart tighten. It was a tiny space, not much larger than a big bedroom, adapted as living quarters. There was a single bed, a sofa bed that was opened, a two-burner stove on an improvised table, and cardboard boxes serving as cabinets. Lucy was sitting on the sofa bed with an open notebook on her lap and was talking on the phone in a low voice. "Yes, Miss Maureen, I know it's not ideal. No, I can't pick up Jimmy yet. The landlord doesn't accept children here. It's already a miracle he allowed Beth to stay for a few nights. Yes, I'm saving for the deposit on the new apartment, but I need another month. Please, can you keep him just a little longer? I'll pay more if necessary." Her voice broke, and Edward suddenly felt ashamed for spying on such an intimate and painful moment. He retreated silently, returned to the car and sat there motionless for almost half an hour, trying to process what he had discovered. Lucy wasn't just a dedicated waitress. She was a woman desperately fighting to keep together two children, who, for some reason, had been placed under her responsibility. She lived in precarious conditions, saved every penny, and still found in her heart the capacity to smile at coffee shop customers and remember that Mrs. Cecilia liked cinnamon in her jasmine tea. The next day, Edward arrived at the coffee shop with the decision made. He needed to know more. Not as a curious boss or an amateur investigator, but as someone who could, perhaps, make a difference in that situation. During a mid-morning break, when Lucy went to the storage room to get napkins, he discreetly followed her. "Can I help you find something?" he offered, making her turn in surprise. "Ah, Edward. No, thank you. I just need more napkins for the corner tables." He took a deep breath, risking a more direct approach. "Lucy, I hope you don't take offense at the question, but is everything okay with you? You seem tired today." Her face hardened momentarily as if raising an invisible wall. "I'm fine, thank you. I just didn't sleep very well. I understand. Sometimes it's hard to rest when we have many worries." She picked up the box of napkins and turned to leave, but Edward continued. "I have a niece about Bethany's age. It's a beautiful phase, isn't it? They grow up so fast." The name made Lucy freeze in place. Slowly she turned to face him, her eyes suddenly alert and defensive. "How do you know about Bethany?" Edward realized he had been imprudent, but there was no way to retreat. "I heard you mention her yesterday. I thought she might be your daughter." For a long moment Lucy just stared at him, as if assessing a threat. Then her shoulders dropped slightly. "She's not my daughter," she replied dryly, and left the storage room without giving a chance for more questions. During the rest of the day, Edward felt Lucy's cautious gaze on him several times. He had made a strategic mistake, and now needed a new approach. The opportunity arose unexpectedly, almost at the end of the shift. A group of executives occupied a large table, celebrating something with special coffees and a selection of desserts. One of them, visibly intoxicated with something beyond coffee, began to be inappropriate with Lucy, making comments about her appearance and insisting that she sit with them. "Come on, doll. Just a coffee with us. I promise it will be more fun than walking back and forth with that tray." "Sir, I need to attend to the other tables," she replied, politely firm. "Ah, come on. Don't be so serious," he insisted, grabbing Lucy's wrist when she tried to move away. Edward, who was watching the scene from the kitchen, didn't think twice. In seconds, he was beside the table. "Excuse me, sir. The waitress needs to continue with her work." The man looked Edward up and down, evaluating the kitchen assistant with disdain. "And who are you to interfere?" "Go back to your sink, buddy." Edward felt his blood boil. He was about to reveal his true identity when Lucy intervened with surprising calmness. "Sir, you're disturbing the other customers. If you continue, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man released her wrist, laughing sarcastically. "Look at that. The doll has claws." His colleagues, sensing the tense atmosphere, began to apologize and calm him down. One of them left a generous tip on the table and practically dragged his friend out. When they returned to the kitchen, Lucy surprised Edward with a look of genuine gratitude. "Thank you for trying to help. You didn't have to, but I appreciate the intention." He felt that was the moment to try again. "Lucy, I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I didn't mean to be intrusive," she sighed, suddenly looking older and more tired. "It's okay, just don't mention Bethany here, please. It's complicated. I understand. If you need anything at all, you can count on me." For a moment, something passed through her gaze, a rare vulnerability, a momentary opening. But soon the wall was raised again. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm fine, really." That night, Edward didn't follow Lucy. He returned to his penthouse in Beacon Hill, a completely different world from the small room where she lived with Bethany. He sat on the spacious balcony, with a view of the Charles River, a glass of whiskey in hand, and for the first time in years, felt deeply troubled by the contrasts of his city and by the abyss that separated his reality from that of his employees. The next day, he arrived at the coffee shop with a plan. He wouldn't approach Lucy directly, wouldn't try to force a conversation or a confession. He would observe, learn, and perhaps when the right moment came, find a way to help without hurting the pride of that woman who clearly was fighting to solve her problems alone. What Edward didn't know was that his actions had already aroused Marcy's suspicion. The manager observed him with growing curiosity, intrigued by the new employee's sudden interest in the most discreet waitress of the establishment. A week passed since the incident with the inappropriate customer. Autumn advanced in Boston, bringing cold mornings and golden evenings that bathed the tables of Mitchell Coffee with an almost cinematic light. Edward had established himself in a routine that allowed him to observe Lucy discreetly, while executing his kitchen assistant tasks with a dedication that surprised even Miss Zelda. "I've never seen anyone take pot cleaning so seriously," commented the pastry chef one morning as he meticulously polished an aluminum pan. "If you continue like this, you're going to wear through the bottom," Edward smiled, without revealing that this manual work, so distant from his board meetings and financial spreadsheets, had become strangely therapeutic. While his hands were occupied with simple tasks, his mind worked on a plan to better understand Lucy's situation and the children she was trying to protect. That Tuesday, he decided to implement the first phase of what he mentally called Operation Truth. Using his contacts, he sent a supposed health inspector for a surprise inspection at the coffee shop. The man, actually a consultant hired by Edward, was instructed to be especially rigorous with the service area, Lucy's territory. The fake inspector arrived shortly after lunch, when the movement was calmer. Marcy received him with the usual tense efficiency, trying to hide her nervousness. The news of the inspection quickly spread among the employees, generating a wave of apprehension. "Edward, finish cleaning those cups, and then check if we have all the licenses in the blue folder in the office," ordered Marcy, visibly stressed. From the kitchen, Edward observed how each employee reacted to the pressure. Peter became strangely silent, concentrating on his coffee machines. Mrs. Zelda grumbled about useless bureaucracy while storing ingredients in the refrigerator. But it was Lucy's reaction that interested him most. The waitress showed no panic or irritation. She continued serving customers with the same calmness as always, while discreetly adjusting small details, straightened the napkin holders, checked the temperature of the drinks before serving them, reorganized the condiment counter. It wasn't the reaction of someone trying to hide problems, but of someone naturally striving to do the best possible. When the inspector approached her, asking questions about hygiene procedures and food preservation, Lucy responded with confidence and precision. Not once did she mention that those questions should be directed to management, nor did she try to dodge responsibilities. "Impressive," murmured Edward to himself, watching the scene through the kitchen window. "She naturally assumes responsibility for the whole." The inspector left after 2 hours of meticulous inspection, leaving Marcy visibly relieved, although he had pointed out some minor irregularities in the report. The entire team seemed exhausted, as if they had run a marathon. "Good job, everyone," said Marcy, gathering everyone in the kitchen after the inspector's departure. "We had a few points to correct, but we passed. Now let's get back to normal work." Edward noticed that Lucy was the only one who didn't seem to relax after the announcement. She simply nodded and returned to the salon, as if the inspection had been just another routine event in her day. 2 days later came the second test. Edward arranged for a mystery shopper visit, a common practice in the food industry, but one that had never been implemented in that specific unit of Mitchell Coffee. The hired woman had instructions to be especially demanding with Lucy, making complex orders and complaining, even when everything was perfect. The mystery shopper arrived around 4 in the afternoon, a time when Lucy usually took a quick coffee break. Edward had timed everything so that she would have to interrupt her moment of rest. "Excuse me," called the woman sitting at the furthest table in the salon. "Could you serve me, please?" Edward observed Lucy set down her still full coffee cup, adjust her apron, and head to the table with her polite smile. There was no sigh of frustration, no look of irritation, just the sense of duty that seemed to guide all her actions. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" What followed was a sequence of impossible requests. A coffee that wasn't on the menu, a dessert without sugar, but that maintained the sweet taste, water neither too cold nor room temperature. With each request, Lucy responded with viable alternatives, always patient, always seeking to accommodate the customer's needs within the possibilities of the establishment. When the woman finally complained that her cappuccino had too much foam, something that Peter had meticulously prepared following the house standard, Lucy didn't hesitate. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I'll get you another one immediately, the way you prefer." There was no exchange of irritated glances with Peter, no attempt to explain that that was the correct standard. Just the quiet acceptance that the customer deserved to be served according to their preferences, even when these contradicted the house norms. Edward was impressed, but still not satisfied. He wanted to see how Lucy would react under more intense pressure, especially involving money, a resource that he knew was scarce and precious to her. The next day, he created a situation where Lucy's cash register showed a difference of $50 at the end of the shift. Marcy, following company protocols, which Edward knew better than anyone, called the waitress for a private conversation in the small office at the back of the store. Edward positioned himself strategically near the door, pretending to organize coffee packages in the hallway. "Lucy, we have a problem," began Marcy with her official tone. "The cash register from your shift is $50 short. Do you have any explanation?" There was a moment of silence before Lucy responded, with a calm voice. "No, Marcy, I checked all the orders and the amounts match. But if money is missing, I'll take responsibility and make the deposit tomorrow. You understand that this is serious, right? If it happens again, I'll be forced to open an investigation." "I understand perfectly. It won't happen again." There were no protests of innocence, no attempt to blame the system or other employees. Just the serene acceptance of a responsibility that Edward knew well wasn't hers. He himself had created that situation, removing the money from the cash register after Lucy had correctly closed her accounts. That night, after the shift, Edward remained at the coffee shop after everyone left. He sat alone in the darkened salon, with only the dim light from the kitchen illuminating the environment. Was what he was doing right? Testing the integrity of an employee who clearly already faced enough difficulties? Using his power as the owner to manipulate situations and observe reactions? For the first time, he questioned his own motivations. It wasn't just about understanding the operation of the coffee shop or identifying exceptional employees. There was something about Lucy that intrigued him on a personal level, something that went beyond the employer-employee relationship. Lost in thought, Edward almost didn't notice the back door opening. By instinct, he retreated into the shadows of the hallway. It was Lucy, returning to the coffee shop after everyone had gone. And she wasn't alone. Bethany accompanied her, firmly holding her hand, but there was someone else. A small boy, no more than 6 years old, with the same big eyes and the same dark hair as the girl. "Aunt Lucy, can Jimmy sleep on the couch today?" asked Bethany, as the three silently entered the employee break area. "Yes, dear. Today you two stay here with me. Early tomorrow, before the coffee shop opens, we'll take him back to Ms. Maureen's house." "But why can't I stay with you and Beth?" The boy's voice was small, almost a whisper. Lucy knelt to be at his height, holding his shoulders gently. "Jimmy, my love, we've talked about this. The place where I'm living is very small. The owner doesn't allow children. Beth is only with me because it's an emergency, just for a few more weeks. As soon as I can rent our new apartment, we'll all be together forever. Promise?" The boy's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and fear. "I promise with all my heart." Edward retreated even further, feeling like an intruder before such an intimate moment. The relationship between Lucy and the children was clearly deep, filled with a love that seemed to transcend blood ties. Who were they really? What was the story behind that unlikely family? He decided it was time to stop the tests. He had seen enough to know that Lucy was much more than a simple, efficient waitress. She was a woman of extraordinary integrity, capable of assuming responsibilities that weren't hers, of protecting others even when she herself was vulnerable, of maintaining dignity in situations that would have broken people with many more resources. The next morning, Edward arrived at the coffee shop, determined to find a way to help Lucy without hurting her pride. But first, he needed to discover more about her story, and for that, he knew exactly where to look. Zelda was in the kitchen before everyone else, as always, preparing the dough for the cakes that would be served throughout the day. The elderly pastry chef was known not only for her impeccable recipes, but also for knowing the stories of all the employees who had ever passed through the Mitchell chain. "Good morning. Mrs. Zelda, I came in early to help with the preparations." The woman raised a grey eyebrow, suspicious of so much enthusiasm. "Good morning, Edward. You can start by separating the pans for the carrot and chocolate cakes." As they worked side by side, Edward gradually led the conversation to the subject that interested him. "Miss Zelda, I've been working here for almost a month and I still feel like a stranger. You who have been here since the beginning must know everyone very well." The pastry chef laughed, sifting the flour with precise movements. "I do indeed. I've seen many arrive full of dreams and leave full of disillusions. Few stay for very long in this business. Lucy seems to be an exception, doesn't she? So dedicated." Miss Zelda briefly stopped what she was doing, looking at Edward with more attention. "Why so much interest in Lucy, young man? This is the third day you've mentioned her name." Edward felt his face heat up. The old pastry chef was more observant than she appeared. "Just curiosity. She seems different from the other employees, more committed." Mrs. Zelda returned to her task, but her voice took on a more serious tone. "Lucy has her reasons for being the way she is. It's not a story that's mine to tell, but I can say that that girl has already gone through more difficulties than most of us." "Was she always a waitress?" The pastry chef let out a short, almost ironic laugh. "A waitress? That girl has a teaching degree, did you know? She was a teacher at a well-regarded private school nearby. She earned well, had a future." Edward almost dropped the pan he was holding. "And what happened?" Miss Zelda sighed, looking at the door as if checking that they were really alone. "As I said, it's not my story to tell. But if you observe carefully, you'll understand that some people give up their own dreams to save the dreams of others. Lucy is that type." Before Edward could insist, the kitchen door opened and Marcy entered, followed by Peter. The moment of confidences had ended, but Edward had obtained a crucial piece of the puzzle. Lucy wasn't just a waitress. She was a trained teacher who, for some reason, had left her profession to work serving coffee. The day went by normally, but Edward couldn't get that information out of his head. During a break, he went to the small locker where employees kept their personal belongings. Lucy's was identified with a discreet label. He knew that what he was about to do violated several company policies and personal ethical principles, but the need to understand the complete situation spoke louder. Looking around to make sure there was no one nearby, he quickly opened the locker. There wasn't much there. A simple purse, a folded coat, a hairbrush, some basic hygiene products. Nothing revealing. When he was about to close the locker, he noticed something fallen at the bottom. A small notebook with a colorful cover, the type used by children to draw. With his heart racing, Edward picked up the notebook and opened it. The first pages were filled with children's drawings. A house, a smiling sun, disproportionate trees, typical drawings of an 8- or 9-year-old child. On the third page, however, there was something that made his blood freeze. A drawing of what appeared to be Mitchell coffee, with hearts in the windows. And underneath, in irregular childish handwriting, the words, "Here I exist." On the back cover, a name written in blue pen, Bethany Silva Santos. Edward quickly closed the notebook and put it back where he had found it, closing the locker. He felt simultaneously guilty for the invasion of privacy and deeply touched by the meaning of that simple drawing. For Bethany, the coffee shop wasn't just a place where her caretaker worked. It was a space where she felt seen, recognized, where she existed. At that moment, Edward made a decision that would change not only his life but the lives of Lucy, Bethany and Jimmy. He would no longer be just an observer or a tester. It was time to act. It was time to use his power as the owner of Mitchell Coffee to do something that really mattered. What he didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Marcy was also making an important discovery. Checking the recordings of the security cameras from the day before, the manager observed with growing suspicion the image of Lucy entering the coffee shop after hours, accompanied by 2 children. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. So tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. Wednesday morning dawned with a fine mist covering the streets of Boston, giving the city a melancholic air. Edward arrived at Mitchell Coffee earlier than usual, determined to initiate his plan to help Lucy and the children. However, upon entering through the back door, he immediately realized that something was wrong. Marcy was in the small office, the door open, her face tense as she spoke on the phone. Mrs. Elder mixed her doughs with unusual vigor, her brow furrowed in concern. Peter organized the cups on the counter with an atypical silence for someone normally so talkative. "Good morning," said Edward, feeling the tension in the air. "Did something happen?" Peter looked at him hesitant, as if evaluating whether he should share the information. "Lucy has been suspended. Marcy called her very early, even before opening the coffee shop." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. "Suspended? Why?" "Improper use of the facilities after operating hours," replied Marcy, who had finished her call and was now standing at the office door. Her tone was professional, but there was something in her eyes, a mixture of disappointment and bureaucratic rigidity. The security cameras showed her entering the coffee shop after hours, accompanied by 2 children. This is expressly prohibited by company regulations. Edward struggled to maintain his composure. He knew exactly what had happened. Marcy had discovered Bethany and Jimmy. But how could he defend Lucy without revealing that he already knew about the situation? Without admitting that he himself had witnessed the children at the coffee shop on other occasions? "Maybe there's an explanation," he suggested, trying to sound casual. "Lucy always seemed so responsible." Marcy let out a heavy sigh. "I was surprised too. She has always been exemplary, which is why I limited the punishment to a temporary suspension. But I can't ignore such a clear violation of the rules. And the worst part is that this happened more than once, from what I could see in the records of the last few weeks." Edward felt a wave of guilt. The evidence that Marcy had found was the result of his own manipulations, the tests he had created to observe Lucy, the nights he had purposely left the coffee shop later to verify if she would bring the children again. "And for how long will she be suspended?" he asked, trying to disguise his concern. "A week initially. After that, the board will decide if she can return or if she will be fired. I've already sent a detailed report to headquarters with the camera images attached." Edward swallowed hard. The report would be sent directly to his office, where his secretary would probably file it along with dozens of other administrative problems that never really reached his desk. The irony of the situation didn't escape him. He was simultaneously the unwitting author of the problem and the only person who could definitively solve it. "I understand," he said finally. "Who will cover her shift?" "We temporarily hired Teresa, who worked here last year. She arrives in an hour. Meanwhile, we'll all have to pull double duty." The coffee shop opened as usual, but there was an atmosphere of discomfort among the employees. Regular customers immediately noticed Lucy's absence, asking Peter or Marcy about her, who offered evasive answers about temporary leave. Edward observed everything with growing concern, divided between his disguise as a kitchen assistant and his responsibility as the owner. Around 11 in the morning, he made a decision. Feigning a headache, he asked Marcy for permission to leave early. The manager, overwhelmed with Lucy's absence, just nodded distractedly. Once outside the coffee shop, Edward drove straight to Lucy's address. The simple neighborhood seemed even more melancholic under the persistent mist of that day. He parked in front of the house with the rusty gate and hesitated, questioning what he would say. How would he explain his presence there? How would he offer help without revealing his true identity or without hurting the pride of a woman who clearly valued her independence? Before he could decide, the door of the small guest house in the back opened. Lucy came out wearing simple clothes. Instead of the coffee shop uniform, jeans and a long-sleeved blouse. She carried in her arms a small bundle, which Edward soon realized was Jimmy's coat. She locked the door and walked hurriedly to the street, without noticing the parked car or its occupant. Edward waited for her to move away a bit, and then followed her discreetly. Lucy took a bus, which he followed with his car, maintaining a safe distance. 20 minutes later, she got off in an even simpler neighborhood, with narrow streets and crowded houses. Walking for a few blocks, she finally stopped in front of a house with low walls, with potted plants on the porch and a tire swing hanging from a tree in the small garden. She rang the bell and waited, her body tense, her hands nervously clutching the child's coat. The door was opened by a white-haired lady with a gentle face, whom Edward presumed to be Ms. Maureen, the person who cared for Jimmy. The conversation between the two seemed tense, with Lucy gesticulating more emphatically than usual. Even at a distance, it was possible to perceive her desperation. After a few minutes, the lady invited Lucy in, and Edward remained there in the car, not knowing what to do. Half an hour later, when Lucy left the house, her face was visibly dejected. She walked slowly to the bus stop, her shoulders slumped in silent defeat. Edward didn't follow her back. Something in that scene, the wounded dignity of that woman who even in extreme difficulties remained standing, prevented him from continuing his surveillance. Instead, he drove back to the city center, straight to the commercial building where the Mitchell coffee chain headquarters was located. He entered through the back, using his private key, and went directly to his office on the 10th floor. His secretary, Sandra, looked surprised to see him in such informal attire, jeans and a simple shirt, the improvised uniform he used in his disguise. "Mr. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you today." "An emergency came up, Sandra. I need to resolve some urgent matters." Without giving further explanations, he entered his office and closed the door. The spacious office, with a panoramic view of the Charles River, seemed strangely alien to the reality he had witnessed in the last few weeks. The designer furniture, the paintings by New England artists on the walls, the noble wood floor, everything spoke of a world of privileges that now deeply bothered him. He sat at his desk and opened the computer. First, he located Lucy Reed's file in the HR system. As he suspected, there wasn't much there. Basic data, payment history, consistently positive evaluations. No mention of her academic background or previous experience as a teacher. Next, using resources that only the company owner had access to, he sought more detailed information. He discovered that Lucy had been hired exactly 1 year and 10 months ago. Her salary was the basic for the category, with only a small increase after the first year. Her overtime was consistent. She was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. She had never asked for days off or missed work due to illness. Edward leaned back in his chair, reflecting. The story didn't make sense. Why would a trained teacher abandon her career to work as a waitress, earning much less and in more difficult conditions? What had happened to force her to such a change? And what was her relationship with Bethany and Jimmy? The answer came when, moved by an intuition, he searched for Lucy's full name in an online search engine. The first result was a newspaper article from 2 years ago. The title made his heart tighten. "Tragedy in South End. Couple suffers fatal accident, leaving 2 small children." The report told the story of Paul and Regina Santos, victims of a traffic accident when returning from work. They had left 2 children, Bethany, then 6 years old, and Jimmy, 4. According to the article, the children were under the temporary guardianship of their godmother, identified as Lucy Reed, a teacher and close friend of the family. "My God," murmured Edward, the pieces finally fitting together. Lucy wasn't an opportunist, using the coffee shop as a temporary shelter for unknown children. She was a woman who had assumed responsibility for 2 orphaned children, giving up her own career and comfort to keep them together and protected. Continuing his research, he found another report, more recent, which briefly mentioned that the process of definitive adoption of the children by the godmother was underway but faced bureaucratic difficulties due to the inadequate financial and housing conditions of the temporary guardian. Everything made sense now. Lucy worked as a waitress because the hours allowed her to take care of the children in alternate periods, leaving Jimmy with Ms. Maureen during the day and Bethany at school. The girl probably stayed alone in the small guest house for a few hours after school until Lucy finished her shift. But when this wasn't possible, like on nights of heavy rain or when Jimmy needed to stay with her, Lucy resorted to the coffee shop as a temporary and safe shelter. She wasn't using the company. She was desperately trying to keep an improvised family together, fighting against a system that threatened to separate 2 children who had already lost everything. Edward felt a mixture of admiration and shame. Admiration for the strength of that woman who, without fanfare or victimism, carried such a heavy burden. Shame for having doubted her intentions, for having tested her, for having invaded her privacy. Taking a deep breath, he made a decision. It wasn't enough just to reverse the suspension or protect her job. Lucy deserved more, much more than a gesture of charity or a temporary solution. He spent the following hours making calls and organizing documents. First, he contacted his legal department, giving specific instructions on how to discreetly help with the adoption process. Then he called the human resources manager to discuss the creation of a new position in the company, one that could take advantage of Lucy's training as a teacher. Finally, he called his real estate broker, requesting the immediate location of a 2-bedroom apartment near the coffee shop, in a safe neighborhood that could be rented immediately, with the company as guarantor. When he finished, it was almost night. Edward looked out the window of his office, watching the city lights begin to turn on. Somewhere out there, Lucy was probably explaining to Bethany why they couldn't go to the coffee shop at night anymore, why they would have to find another temporary solution until she could save enough money to rent an apartment and reunite the family. What she didn't know was that her life was about to change completely. The next day, Edward didn't go to work at the coffee shop as a kitchen assistant. Instead, he wore one of his well-cut suits and took his leather briefcase. It was time for Edward Mitchell, owner of the coffee shop chain, to make his first public appearance in almost a month. However, before revealing his identity to Lucy, there was one last thing he needed to do. He drove to Miss Maureen's house, the lady who took care of Jimmy. He needed to better understand the children's situation, learn more about their history, confirm that his plan would really meet the needs of that improvised family. Ms. Maureen received him with the initial distrust of someone who had already seen many promises broken, but as Edward explained who he was and what he intended to do, the lady's expression softened. "So you're the owner of the coffee shop where Lucy works, and you've been posing as an employee all this time?" There was a mixture of incredulity and amusement in her voice. "Exactly. I started as an experiment to better understand the operation of my stores, but I ended up witnessing something much more important." The lady invited him in and offered a simple but well-prepared coffee. In the modest living room, he immediately noticed the children's drawings pinned to the wall. Jimmy's works, he presumed. There were also photos of the children, some including Lucy, others with a couple that Edward supposed were the biological parents. "Jimmy is at school now," explained Ms. Maureen. "He's a good boy, despite everything he's been through. Very quiet but intelligent. Beth is more expressive, talks a lot when she feels safe. Can you tell me more about their situation? About how Lucy became responsible for the children?" Ms. Maureen sighed, adjusting herself in the worn armchair. Regina, the children's mother, was Lucy's best friend since college days. They were teachers at the same school for a while. When Regina and Paul passed away, there was no close family to take the little ones. Lucy didn't hesitate for a minute. She said she would be responsible for them, that they were her godchildren, that she had promised Regina she would always take care of the children if anything happened. The lady paused, sipping her coffee. In the beginning, it was easier. Lucy still worked as a teacher, had a reasonable apartment, but then the school where she taught closed, and she couldn't get a job at another institution that would allow the flexible schedule she needed to take care of the children. The savings ran out. She had to move to a cheaper place, and she started working as a waitress. The salary barely covers basic expenses, let alone renting a place big enough for the three of them. And the adoption process. How is it going? Stalled. The social worker says the conditions aren't adequate. Space too small, unstable income, no formal support network. They've already suggested that the children go to separate homes, but Lucy refuses to allow it. She promised her friend she would keep the siblings together, and she's a woman of her word. Edward nodded, moved by Lucy's loyalty and determination. And the children? How do they handle all this? As best they can. Jimmy is too young to fully understand. Bethany understands more, feels more. That's why she became so attached to the coffee shop where Lucy works. It's the only place where she feels safe besides here. When Lucy is on the night shift, Bethany stays alone in that little back room. It's safe, But what child deserves to be alone after everything she's been through? Ms. Maureen's words weighed on Edward's heart. Bethany's drawing with the coffee shop and the hearts in the windows gained an even deeper meaning. Ms. Maureen, I came here because I want to help, not out of charity or to feel good about myself, but because I believe Lucy deserves support after everything she has done for these children. The lady studied him for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. You like her, don't you? Lucy? The question caught Edward by surprise. He had never put his feelings in those terms, even to himself. I admire her deeply, he replied cautiously. Miss Maureen smiled, a wise smile of someone who has lived enough to recognize what is not said. Admire, of course. Well, if you really want to help, know that Lucy won't accept anything that seems like charity. She has pride, that girl. Good pride, the kind that keeps her standing when everything around is crumbling. I understand perfectly, and I already have a plan that respects that pride. When he left Ms. Maureen's house, Edward felt more secure in his intentions. It wasn't just about solving an administrative problem or exercising his social responsibility as a businessman. It was about recognizing the extraordinary value of an ordinary person and creating opportunities for her to flourish, along with the children she had promised to protect. He returned to his car and picked up the phone. It was time to put his plan into action, starting with a call to Marcy at the coffee shop. Marcy? This is Edward Mitchell, owner of the chain. He paused, listening to the manager's surprise on the other end of the line. Yes, I know it's unexpected. I'm calling about the employee Lucy Reed. I want you to immediately cancel her suspension and summon her for a meeting tomorrow at 10 o'clock. No, not at the coffee shop. At my office at headquarters. And Marcy, don't mention anything about the reason for the meeting. Just say it's an important matter that we need to discuss in person. As he hung up, Edward smiled for the first time in days. The expression on Lucy's face when she discovered who he really was would certainly be priceless. But what would come after? The opportunity he was about to offer her and the children was what really mattered. Lucy observed her reflection in the small bathroom mirror of the guest house. She had chosen her best outfit for the mysterious meeting at the Mitchell chain headquarters: black dress pants that she kept for special occasions and a navy blue long-sleeved blouse. Her hair, normally tied in a functional bun, was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore no makeup besides a discreet lipstick. Marcy's call the night before had been disconcerting. First, the news that her suspension had been cancelled without further explanations. Then, the summons for a meeting at the company headquarters with Edward Mitchell himself, the founder and owner of the coffee shop chain, an almost mythical figure that few employees ever met personally. What could he want with me? She asked herself for the 100th time, while checking if there was any hair out of place. Her mind oscillated between the fear of dismissal and a timid hope that perhaps, just perhaps, something good might happen. Bethany watched her from the small bed where she was still sitting, hugging her worn teddy bear. You look beautiful. Aunt Lucy, said the girl with childish sincerity, like a princess. Lucy smiled, moving away from the mirror to sit beside the child. Thank you, my love, but I'm far from being a princess. You are. The bravest princess in the world, insisted Bethany, with the conviction that only a child can have. Everything will be fine, you'll see. Lucy hugged the girl, seeking in the unshakable faith of that child the courage she needed to face whatever was to come. I promise I'll be back in time to pick you up from school today, she said, pulling back to look into the girl's eyes. And then we'll go see Jimmy. Maybe we can have ice cream together. Bethany's eyes shone with the prospect of the small celebration. Even if the coffee man fires you? The direct question, typical of childish sincerity, made Lucy swallow hard. Even if he fires me. We'll be fine, Beth, we always are, aren't we? The girl nodded, but her eyes revealed a wisdom beyond her years, the wisdom of someone who had already lost too much to believe in absolute promises. Half an hour later, Lucy got off the bus in downtown Boston, in front of the imposing commercial building where the Mitchell coffee chain headquarters was located. The contrast between that structure of glass and steel and the small guest house where she lived was a painful reminder of the social distances that separated her reality from that of the executives who ran the company. At the reception, she identified herself and was instructed to wait. She sat on one of the leather sofas in the lobby, her restless hands on her lap, observing the coming and going of well-dressed people who apparently were secure in their place in the world. She felt displaced, as if wearing an invisible outfit that identified her as someone who didn't belong in that environment. "Miss Reed?" The receptionist called her after a few minutes. "Mr. Mitchell will see you now. 10th floor, last door on the right when you exit the elevator." Lucy thanked her with a nod and headed to the elevator, her heart beating ever harder. What could the owner of a coffee shop chain want with a simple waitress? The most likely answer, that he wanted to fire her personally due to the severity of her infraction, made her stomach tighten. If she lost her job, how would she pay the rent? How would she convince the social worker that she was capable of taking care of Bethany and Jimmy? The elevator rose smoothly to the 10th floor. When the doors opened, Lucy took a deep breath, adjusted her posture, and walked down the silent corridor, her steps muffled by the thick carpet. She stopped before the last door on the right, a dark wood door with a discreet plaque that said Edward Mitchell, President. She knocked lightly and heard a "come in" from inside. With a final inspiration to gather courage, she turned the handle and entered. The office was large and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The decor was sophisticated but discreet, with works by New England artists on the walls and contemporary design furniture. Behind an imposing dark wood desk with his back to the door was a man observing the city below. "Miss Reed, thank you for coming," he said, still without turning. "Please sit down." There was something strangely familiar about that voice, but Lucy couldn't immediately identify it. She sat in the indicated chair, her hands tight on her lap, trying to control the tremor that was beginning to manifest. When the man finally turned, Lucy felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "Edward!" The name escaped her lips before she could contain herself, formality forgotten in the face of shock. There he was, the same man who had worked alongside her in the coffee shop kitchen during the last few weeks, washing pots, organizing stocks, observing her discreetly. But now he wore an impeccably cut suit, and his bearing was completely different. Confident, authoritative, accustomed to power. "Surprised?" he asked with a small smile on his lips. Lucy felt a wave of contradictory emotions, shock, confusion, and finally, indignation. She rose abruptly, her hands clutching her purse tightly. Was this some kind of game? A test? "You've been posing as a kitchen assistant to what, to spy on your employees?" Edward raised his hands in an appeasing gesture. "Please sit down. I'll explain everything, I promise." Something in the sincerity of his tone made Lucy hesitate. Slowly she sat down again, but the tension in her body was evident. "I'm listening," she said, her cold tone masking the emotional storm she felt. Edward circled the desk and sat in the chair next to her, instead of maintaining the physical barrier between them. 2 months ago, I started receiving increasingly disconnected reports about the reality of my stores. Numbers, statistics, performance evaluations, all very technical, very distant from what really happens day to day. I decided I needed to see with my own eyes. Feel firsthand what it means to work in one of my coffee shops. He paused, studying Lucy's reaction, who remained impassive. I chose the financial district unit because it was one of the oldest and most emblematic. I created a false identity, presented myself as an ordinary man looking for a job, and Marcy hired me without asking many questions. "And what did you discover with your little experiment?" asked Lucy, her voice laden with contained irony. "I discovered that there was an abyss between the reports that reached my desk and the reality on the shop floor. I discovered flaws in processes, waste that no one reported, dynamics among employees that no spreadsheet could capture." He leaned slightly forward, his gaze intense. "But mainly, Lucy, I discovered you." She blinked, disconcerted by the direct declaration. "What do you mean?" "I discovered an employee who didn't stand out in sales numbers or efficiency metrics, but who carried within herself the true essence of what I always wanted my chain to represent. Genuine care, attention to detail, respect for customers. And then," he hesitated, knowing he was about to reveal that he knew her most intimate secret. "And then," she insisted, feeling there was more, "and then, on a rainy night, I returned to the coffee shop after hours to pick up my forgotten badge and saw something that would completely change my perception. You, welcoming a child who needed shelter. Lucy paled, so he knew. From the beginning, he knew about Bethany and Jimmy. "Was it you who reported me to Marcy?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Edward shook his head emphatically. "No, not at all. Marcy found the images on her own, during a routine check of the security cameras. And now you're going to fire me officially?" There was a dignified resignation in her voice, like someone who was already expecting the final blow. "Fire you?" Edward smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes. "Lucy, I came to invite you to take on the coordination of a new project for the chain." She blinked, certain she had misunderstood. A project? Edward stood up and walked to a folder on his desk. He opened it and took out some documents which he handed to Lucy. "The Mitchell Social Coffee, a new arm of our chain, dedicated to training young people in vulnerable situations for the job market. And I want you to be the general coordinator." Lucy looked at the papers in her hands, a detailed project with budget, implementation schedule, objectives, and goals. Her name already appeared as the technical person in charge. "I don't understand. Why me?" "Because you are exactly what this project needs. A person who sees beyond appearances, who genuinely believes in people's potential, who understands what it means to be in a vulnerable situation." He paused, hesitating before continuing. "I know you have a teaching degree. Lucy, I know you were a teacher before coming to work as a waitress." Her face hardened again. "Have you been investigating my life? I needed to understand your story to be able to help in the right way." "And what else did you discover?" There was a challenge in her voice, but also a vulnerability that she couldn't completely hide. Edward took a deep breath before answering. "I know about the accident that took the lives of your friends Regina and Paul. I know that you took guardianship of Bethany and Jimmy, your godchildren, and that you've been fighting against a bureaucratic system to keep the siblings together. I know that you left your career as a teacher to be able to have flexible hours and take care of the children. I know that you live in precarious conditions to save every penny." Lucy's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. "And you thought you could solve my life with corporate charity?" The question was sharp, defensive, but Edward wasn't offended. Ms. Maureen had warned him about Lucy's pride. "No, Lucy, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering an opportunity. For you, for the children, and for my company. This isn't a project of empty philanthropy. It's a business with a social purpose, which needs someone with your qualifications and your life experience to function." He pointed to the documents in her hands. "The salary is specified on the 3rd page. It's compatible with the market for an educational coordinator with your training. The hours are flexible, allowing you to reconcile work with family responsibilities. And yes, there are additional benefits, such as a family health plan that covers you, Bethany, and Jimmy." Lucy leafed through the documents, stunned by the proposal. It was more than she could have dreamed of, a job that utilized her training, that paid enough to keep the family together, that offered the stability she so needed to finalize the adoption process. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, raising her eyes from the papers to face him. The question caught Edward off guard. For a moment, he considered answering with platitudes about corporate social responsibility or about valuing talent. But something in Lucy's direct gaze demanded honesty. "Because you taught me something that no MBA or leadership course ever could. You taught me that the true value of a business isn't in profits or expansion, but in the impact it has on people's lives. You taught me that there is a silent nobility in doing the right thing. Even when no one is watching." He paused, seeking the right words. "And because, at some point during these weeks, watching you care for customers with kindness, take on responsibilities that weren't yours, protect 2 children against all odds. At some point, Lucy, I cared. Not just as your employer, not just as a distant observer. I cared as someone who recognized in you a rare humanity, a strength that deserves to be supported." The sincerity of that response left Lucy speechless. For long moments, only silence filled the spacious office. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked again at the documents in her hands. "I need to think," she said softly. "It's a lot to absorb at once." "Of course," replied Edward, leaning back in his chair. "Take all the time you need. But there's one more thing I'd like to show you before you go." He stood up and took another envelope from his desk. "This isn't conditional on your acceptance of the job. It's a gift without any obligation or expectation. Lucy opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, she found an apartment key and a rental contract already signed, with the Mitchell Coffee Company as guarantor. The address was in a quiet neighborhood, a few blocks from the school where Bethany studied. It's a 2-bedroom apartment, furnished, ready to receive the 3 of you. The rent is already paid for the next 6 months. Enough time for you to establish yourself in the new position, should you accept, and for the adoption process to be finalized. The tears that Lucy had contained until then finally ran down her face. Why are you doing all this for me? For us? You barely know me. Edward thought about the question for a moment. There were so many possible answers, some pragmatic, others idealistic, some that he wasn't yet ready to formulate even to himself. Because we all deserve a bit of unexpected kindness, Lucy, especially those who, like you, have already given so much without asking for anything in return. He approached and extended his hand. You don't need to decide now, but I would very much like you to visit the apartment today. Take Bethany and Jimmy. See if it's suitable for you. Lucy looked at the extended hand, at the documents in her lap, at the key that represented much more than a simple property. It represented stability, security, the possibility of keeping her promise to 2 children who had lost everything. Slowly, she stood up and accepted the handshake. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She just nodded, her eyes still bright with tears. But now there was something more in them, a glimpse of hope, timid but undeniable. Thank you, was all she could say. Edward accompanied her to the office door. Before leaving, Lucy stopped and turned to him, a final question on her lips. That day, when you defended me from the inappropriate customer, you could have revealed who you were. You could have used your authority. Why didn't you? He smiled, remembering the moment. Because I wanted to see how you would handle the situation. And you surprised me, as always. You resolved the problem with dignity and firmness, without needing a man to save. You? A small smile appeared on Lucy's lips, the first genuine smile since she had entered that office. Thank you for not treating me like a damsel in distress. You are many things, Lucy Reed, but you are definitely not a damsel in distress. You are the heroine of your own story, and of Bethany and Jimmy's story. With those words she left, carrying with her the documents that could change her life forever. Edward remained there, watching the closed door, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and peace. He had done what he could. Now the decision was hers. That afternoon, as Lucy walked hand in hand with Bethany and Jimmy through the streets of Boston, toward the address of the new apartment, her mind buzzed with questions, doubts, and possibilities. It was risky to accept so much help at once. Was it prudent to trust someone who had disguised himself to observe her? But then, looking at the hopeful faces of the 2 children by her side, Lucy realized that some opportunities are too rare to be wasted out of pride or distrust. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to accept that not all battles needed to be fought alone. And as for Edward, sitting in his spacious office with a view of the city, a certainty grew in his heart. Regardless of Lucy's decision, his life and his values as a businessman had been transformed forever by the example of a waitress who found strength to care for others, even when her own life was in pieces. 3 months had passed since that meeting on the 10th floor of the commercial building. Winter was giving way to a timid spring in Boston, with still cold mornings but sunny afternoons that brought new life to the city's squares and gardens. In the Forest Hills neighborhood, on a tree-lined and quiet street, an old but well-maintained building housed the newest venture of the Mitchell coffee chain, the Social Coffee. Unlike the other units, with their sober colors and contemporary decoration, this space had colorful walls, rustic wooden tables, and a welcoming atmosphere that more resembled a family home than a commercial establishment. Lucy adjusted the collar of her royal blue shirt with the new Social Coffee logo, a stylized coffee cup with an open door at the center, symbolizing opportunities. She no longer wore the black uniform of the chain's waiters, but casual and comfortable clothes that reflected her new position as coordinator. Raphael, check the espresso machine again, too much water is coming out, she instructed a young man of approximately 17, who nodded seriously and immediately turned his attention to the equipment. Raphael was one of 10 young people in the first class of the project, teenagers in situations of social vulnerability who received professional training, scholarships, and the opportunity for a first formal job. Some came from shelters, others from broken families, all with stories of challenges that Lucy knew all too well. "Ms. Lucy, so the cakes are all sliced and organized," announced Camilla, a girl with colorful hair and a shy smile, who had shown herself to be especially talented in pastry making. "Great, Camilla. Remember to note which flavors are most requested today, so we can adjust tomorrow's production." The girl nodded, proud of the responsibility. For many of those young people, the simple fact of being trusted to perform meaningful tasks already represented a revolution in their self-esteem. The coffee shop had been officially inaugurated just a month ago, but it was already beginning to win a loyal clientele, partly out of curiosity about the new concept, partly for the maintained quality of Mitchell products, and partly, Lucy suspected, for the buzz created around the story that had inspired the project. Although Edward had insisted that Lucy's personal narrative remain private, the local media had become interested in the coffee shop, run by young people in vulnerable situations. A report from Boston's main newspaper ended up discovering fragments of the story. The teacher who had become a waitress to support her orphaned godchildren, the owner disguised as a kitchen assistant, the initiative to transform an individual situation into a broader social project. The article went viral, generating a wave of interest that surpassed the borders of Massachusetts. Soon, other national news networks reproduced the story, transforming the social coffee into an example of genuine corporate social responsibility. "Nervous about today?" asked Teresa, the experienced barista whom Edward had hired to assist in training the young people. She was the only conventional employee besides Lucy, a bridge between the traditional corporate world and the social approach of the new project. "A little," admitted Lucy, checking for the third time if everything was in order for the special event that afternoon. "I never imagined I would be on the other side of an interview for a business magazine." Teresa smiled, adjusting some cups that were already perfectly aligned. "You deserve all the recognition. Lucy, you transformed a personal drama into something that is helping dozens of people." Lucy shook her head, still uncomfortable with the compliments she frequently received since the beginning of the project. "I didn't do anything alone." "If Edward hadn't, Edward created the structure, but the soul of the social coffee is yours," interrupted Teresa, with the frankness that characterized her. "He himself says that to whoever wants to listen." Before Lucy could respond, the coffee shop door opened and a lively group entered, Bethany and Jimmy, accompanied by Ms. Maureen, who was now a constant presence in the family's life, a kind of adopted grandmother who helped care for the children while Lucy worked. "Mom!" shouted Jimmy, running to hug Lucy's legs with the energy of his 6 years. The word still sounded strange and wonderful to her ears. Mom, a title that had become official only 3 weeks before, when the judge finally signed the adoption papers, legally making Bethany and Jimmy her children. The achievement had been celebrated with a small party in the new apartment, with the presence of close friends and, of course, Edward. "Hi, my love," Lucy replied, bending down to hug the boy. "How was school today?" "The teacher let us do an experiment with plants. Look what I got." He showed a small pot with a recently planted bean, proud of his first scientific experiment. Bethany approached more contained, at 10 years old already developing a more reserved posture, although her eyes shone with the same happiness as her brother's. "I brought my drawing notebook," she announced. "I want to show it to Uncle Edward when he arrives." Lucy smiled, running her hand through the girl's hair, now well cared for and tied in an elaborate braid that Ms. Maureen had made. "He should arrive at any moment. Why don't you sit at that table near the window? It's your favorite, isn't it?" Bethany nodded and headed to the spot, already taking her case of colored pencils out of her backpack. That specific table, strategically positioned under the natural light that entered through the large window, had become her personal space in the coffee shop, a little corner where she spent hours drawing while Lucy worked. It was impressive, thought Lucy, as she watched her daughter organize her materials, how some emotional wounds were beginning to heal. Bethany, who had spent months in silence after the tragedy that had taken her parents, now spoke more, smiled frequently, and her passion for drawing had flourished under more stable conditions. Jimmy, in turn, seemed to have overcome the fear of separation that made him constantly ask when they could all be together. Now secure in his new home, with the adoption formalized, he allowed himself to simply be a child, with concerns appropriate to his age. The journalist called to say she'll be half an hour late, informed Teresa, approaching with a cup of tea for Miss Maureen. Something about traffic on the Memorial Drive. That gives us more time to review everything, replied Lucy, mentally checking the list of topics that Edward had suggested she address in the interview. The relationship between them had evolved into something that Lucy still didn't know how to completely name. For it wasn't just professional. There was a mutual respect and admiration that transcended corporate hierarchies. It wasn't just friendship. There was a subtle tension, a special care in the choice of words, a different sparkle in the gaze when they were together. But it also wasn't romance. Both maintained a respectful distance, aware of the complications that could arise. Edward visited the social coffee at least twice a week, always finding time in his busy schedule to follow the progress of the project. In each visit, he brought some small surprise for Bethany and Jimmy, a book, an educational game, or simply stories about his travels. The children adored him, especially Bethany, who had chosen him as the confidant for her dreams of becoming an artist. Lucy couldn't deny that these visits were the highlight of her weeks. There was something in Edward's presence that made her feel simultaneously challenged and supported, a rare combination that drove her to constantly expand the horizons of the project. "Lucy, the reporters have arrived," announced Raphael, interrupting her thoughts. "They're waiting at the entrance." She took a deep breath, adjusted the badge with her name and function, and headed to the door. On the way, she briefly stopped beside Bethany's table. "You'll do great, Mom," said the girl without raising her eyes from her drawing. "Just tell our story the way it is." The simplicity of the advice brought a smile to Lucy's lips. It was exactly what Edward had said the night before, during the phone call where they discussed the interview. Without embellishments, without excessive dramatization, she remembered his words. "The truth is already powerful enough, Lucy. Tell the story as it is, and let people draw their own conclusions." The magazine team entered. A journalist with an intelligent expression, a photographer carrying professional equipment, and an assistant with a recorder. Lucy received them with the same kindness she dedicated to the coffee shop customers, guiding them to a more reserved table at the back of the establishment, where the interview could take place without interrupting the normal operation of the place. When they were about to begin, the coffee shop door opened again, and Edward Mitchell entered, wearing an impeccable navy blue suit, but with a relaxed posture that contrasted with the traditional image of a businessman. Seeing him, Bethany abandoned her drawing and ran to hug him, while Jimmy, not wanting to be left behind, jumped from the chair where he was sitting to join the hug. "Sorry I'm late," said Edward, after greeting the children. "The traffic is impossible today." The journalist observed the scene with professional interest, clearly intrigued by the naturalness with which the powerful businessman interacted with the children, and by the way Lucy smiled while watching them, a discreet smile, but loaded with meanings. "Mr. Mitchell." "Good that you could come," greeted the journalist, extending her hand. "We're eager to hear about this innovative initiative." Edward greeted the team cordially, but made it clear from the beginning. "I'm here just as support. This is Lucy's story, and the extraordinary work she has been developing. I was just the facilitator." The interview flowed naturally. Lucy, initially nervous, found her voice when talking about the purpose of the social coffee, about the young people who were receiving their first professional opportunity, about the mixture of business and social impact that guided the project. When questioned about her personal story, she shared the essentials: the tragedy that had left her godchildren orphaned, her decision to take responsibility for them, the challenges of reconciling work and improvised motherhood. "Many people would have given up," commented the journalist at one point. "What kept you going forward?" Lucy looked at the table where Bethany had returned to her drawing, and at Jimmy, who was now showing his planted bean to Raphael, explaining with scientific seriousness how the plant would grow. "When I promised my friend that I would take care of her children if anything happened, I never imagined that I would have to fulfill that promise. But some promises are too sacred to be broken, no matter how difficult it is to keep them." She paused, thoughtful. "And honestly, These children saved me as much as I saved them. They gave me a purpose when I could have lost myself in my own grief for the death of such dear friends. Edward, who was observing Lucy with an expression of barely disguised admiration, added, "It was this determination that impressed me from the beginning. Seeing Lucy create impossible solutions with minimal resources, maintain dignity in the most challenging circumstances. This made me question what it really means to be successful." The journalist caught the look that the two exchanged, brief, but loaded with a mutual understanding that transcended words. "And how did the specific idea of the social coffee arise?" she asked, redirecting the conversation to the project. It was Edward who answered, "I realized that what Lucy needed wasn't charity, but an opportunity that would take advantage of her skills and experiences. She has a teaching degree, has a natural talent for guiding people, and knows firsthand what it means to fight against adversities." He gestured around, indicating the welcoming space of the coffee shop. "At the same time, I saw young people in our communities facing similar barriers, lack of opportunities, prejudices, bureaucratic systems that hinder instead of facilitate. The social coffee was a way to transform an individual case into a broader solution." The interview continued for more than an hour, covering practical aspects of the project, preliminary results, expansion plans. When the photographer asked to take some images of Lucy with the young apprentices, Edward took the opportunity to sit beside Bethany. "What are you drawing today?" he asked, genuinely interested in the girl's work. She turned the notebook so he could see, a colorful portrait of the coffee shop, with all the employees, customers, and in the center, a representation of her new family, Lucy, Jimmy herself, Miss Maureen, and surprisingly, Edward himself. "It's our coffee shop family," she explained with the simple and direct logic of children. "Everyone who helped us stay together." Edward felt a lump in his throat upon seeing himself included in that family representation. He lightly touched the drawing, admiring the details that Bethany had captured, Lucy's determined posture, Jimmy's ever-present smile, even his own tendency to keep his hands in his pockets when he was thoughtful. "It's an incredible drawing. Beth, you're becoming a true artist." "I'm going to be an illustrator when I grow up," she stated with conviction. "And then I'll have my own coffee shop. Just like you and Mom." He smiled at the simplicity of the girl's life plan. "I'm sure it will be the most beautiful coffee shop in Boston." When the magazine team finally left, with promises that the article would be published in the next month's edition, the coffee shop was almost empty. The workday was coming to an end, and the young apprentices were organizing the environment for closing, under Teresa's discreet supervision. "I think it went well," commented Lucy, finally sitting down after hours on her feet. "I hope I didn't talk too much." Edward smiled, occupying the chair in front of her. It was perfect, authentic, sincere, without the clichés that usually accompany these stories of overcoming. A comfortable silence established itself between them, broken only by the distant murmur of the young people working and by the occasional laughter of Bethany and Jimmy, who were now helping Raphael organize the chairs. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," said Lucy softly. "It seems like it was yesterday that I was hiding Beth on the coffee shop's sofa during the storm, dying of fear of losing my job." Edward observed her profile, the golden light of late afternoon highlighting the contours of her face. "You transformed fear into courage, Lucy, and not just for yourself and the children, for all these young people too." He made a gesture indicating the apprentices who were still working, each with their story of vulnerability, each now with a perspective that didn't exist before. "The social coffee has already received franchise proposals in 3 different cities," he revealed, slightly changing the subject. "Businessmen who visited this space and want to replicate the model. What do you think?" Lucy's eyes widened in surprise. "So fast!" "But we're still learning, adjusting the system. Exactly why we need to start thinking about expansion, so that the model can evolve organically, maintaining its essence." He hesitated before continuing. "And I would like you to lead this expansion. Lucy as Director of Social Projects for the Mitchell chain." The proposal caught her completely off guard. "Edward, I'm barely adapting to this new reality. Director, I don't know if I have enough experience to—" "You have something much more valuable than corporate experience," he interrupted gently. "You have vision, You have genuine empathy and you know in practice the challenges we need to overcome. Seeing the hesitation on her face, he added, "You don't need to answer now. Think about it. We'll talk more after the exhibition's inauguration." Lucy nodded, grateful for the understanding. The exhibition he referred to was a special event planned for the following week. A show of artistic works produced by Bethany and other children in similar situations, who had participated in workshops at the social coffee on Saturdays. The idea had arisen when Edward noticed the girls' talent for drawing and suggested that the coffee shop offer a creative space for children on weekends. What began as a one-time activity became a structured program, with volunteer teachers teaching artistic techniques to children from shelters and social projects. "The exhibition will be a success," stated Edward, standing up. "Bethany has a natural talent, and the other children have also produced incredible works." Lucy also stood up, accompanying him to the door. "Thank you for believing in her. In us." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a gratitude that went beyond the professional. Edward stopped at the door, looking into her eyes for a moment longer than usual. "Believing in you, Lucy, was the easiest and most transformative decision I've ever made." There was so much unsaid in that phrase, so many layers of meaning that both preferred not to explore at that moment. Instead, they said goodbye with the polite formality they maintained in public, promising to talk more about the details of the exhibition in the coming days. When Edward left, Lucy stood at the door for a few moments, observing his figure moving away down the sidewalk. Bethany approached silently and held her hand. "He likes you, Mum," said the girl with the direct simplicity of childhood. "In the special way." Lucy smiled, gently squeezing her daughter's hand. "It's complicated. Beth, we are very different." "The teacher said that the best stories are made of differences that complement each other," replied the girl, with a wisdom that transcended her age. "Like different colors that together make a beautiful drawing." Lucy looked at her daughter with surprise and admiration. In moments like that, she realized that Bethany had inherited the sensitivity and emotional intelligence of her biological mother, Regina, her friend who had so often seen truths that others didn't see. The following week, the Hearts in the Windows exhibition, a name inspired by Bethany's original drawing of the coffee shop, was inaugurated with great success. The second-floor hall of the social coffee, transformed into an improvised gallery, received dozens of visitors, including local authorities, representatives of NGOs, and to everyone's surprise, some important investors interested in the social business model. The children's drawings and paintings, framed with simple elegance, told stories of losses, hopes, and new beginnings. Bethany's work, highlighted on a special wall, showed her artistic evolution, from the first drawings made at the coffee shop, including the famous "Here I Exist," to her more recent works, which captured everyday scenes with surprising sensitivity. During the event, Edward remained discreetly in the background, allowing Lucy and the children to occupy the deserved spotlight. He observed with silent satisfaction the admiring looks that the project coordinator received, the confidence with which she explained the artistic program, the naturalness with which she transitioned between business people and children from the project. "She has completely blossomed, hasn't she?" commented Ms. Maureen, approaching him with a glass of juice in hand. "I barely recognized that frightened young woman from a few months ago." Edward smiled at the lady, for whom he had developed a genuine affection in the last few weeks. Lucy always had this strength within her. Ms. Maureen, she just needed circumstances that allowed it to fully manifest. The elderly woman studied him with her wise eyes for a moment. "And when are you finally going to invite her to dinner? Not as boss and employee, not as project partners. As a man and a woman who have been dancing around each other for too long?" Edward almost choked on the sip of water he was taking. "Ms. Maureen, the situation is complicated, I know," she completed with a mischievous smile. "Everything worthwhile usually is. But those children need stability, and Lucy deserves more than admiration from a distance." Before he could respond, Bethany came running toward them excited. "Uncle Edward, a woman wants to buy my painting. The one of the coffee shop family. She offered real money." Edward knelt down to be at the girl's height. "That's wonderful, Beth. Are you going to sell it?" The girl bit her lip, suddenly unsure. "I don't know. It's special to me. I drew everyone I love. Then perhaps you should keep it for yourself, he suggested gently. The most important things aren't always for sale. Bethany nodded, relieved to have permission to refuse the offer. I'll make a new one for her, even prettier, but different just for her. That's a perfect solution, approved Edward. The mark of a true artist is knowing when a work is too personal to part with. The girl smiled and ran back to tell the buyer her decision. Edward watched her, amazed at the confidence she had developed in such a short time. She has a bit of you, you know, commented Ms. Maureen, following his gaze. That way of finding creative solutions to difficult problems. At the end of the event, when most of the guests had already left, Lucy finally had a moment to sit down. She was exhausted but radiant. The exhibition had been an absolute success. 3 children had sold works. Important contacts had been made for the apprenticeship program, and Bethany had shone as never before, explaining her inspirations with a surprising eloquence for someone so young. "Congratulations," said Edward, sitting beside her and offering a cup of tea. "You transformed a side project into something extraordinary." Lucy accepted the tea with gratitude. It was a team effort. "The volunteer teachers, Teresa, you—" "Always diminishing your own merits," he observed with a smile. "Will you ever learn to accept a compliment without dividing it with other people?" She laughed, a relaxed and genuine sound that Edward had learned to appreciate. "Probably not. It's easier to see the value in others than in ourselves, don't you think?" They remained silent for a moment, observing the almost empty hall, where Jimmy was sleeping on a sofa in the corner, and Bethany was still proudly showing her drawings to Ms. Maureen and Teresa. "I thought about your proposal," said Lucy finally. "Her about the social projects directorship." Edward turned his complete attention to her, awaiting her answer. "I accept with one condition." "Which?" "Saesti, that we can expand the artistic program along with the coffee shop model. What we saw today, the impact on these children's self-esteem, the way they express themselves, it's as important as the professional training of the young people." Edward smiled, admiring once more the holistic vision that Lucy always brought to the project. "Consider it approved. In fact, I was already thinking of something similar, a special fund for artistic scholarships, for children like Bethany who demonstrate exceptional talent." Lucy's eyes shone with the prospect. "That would be incredible. Beth dreams of studying art formally, but I could never—" "Now you can," he interrupted softly, "and not just for her, for dozens of children with similar potential." At that moment, something subtly changed between them. An invisible barrier seemed to dissolve, and Lucy found courage for the question she had been avoiding for months. "Why do you do all this, Edward? And don't tell me it's just corporate social responsibility." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. In the beginning, perhaps it was curiosity, then admiration. But now, he paused, seeking the right words, "Now it's because I discovered that success without purpose is empty. And you, Lucy, showed me a greater purpose than I ever imagined for myself or for my company." There was more, much more, that he wanted to say, but this wasn't the moment or the place. Instead, he offered, "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? Not as employee and boss. Not to discuss the project, just as Lucy and Edward." The surprise on her face gave way to a shy smile. "That would be complicated." "Definitely. But as your daughter wisely quoted, the best stories are made of differences that complement each other." Lucy laughed, shaking her head. "You and Bethany talking about me behind my back? That's unfair. So is that a yes?" he insisted, with a hope he didn't try to hide. She studied him for a long moment, as if seeing beyond the facade of the successful businessman, beyond the man who had transformed her professional life, to the Edward who washed pots in the coffee shop kitchen, who genuinely cared about people others ignored, who saw value where others saw only problems. "It's a yes," she finally replied. The following week, the business magazine published the report about Mitchell's Social Coffee. The article, titled "The Coffee Shop Where Everyone Exists," told the story of a waitress who had risked her job to protect 2 children, of a businessman who had disguised himself to understand the reality of his employees, and of how that unlikely encounter had generated a project that transformed lives. The last page featured a photo that captured the essence of the story. Lucy and Edward, side by side, surrounded by the young apprentices, with Bethany and Jimmy in front, all in front of the social coffee. The most impressive, however, was the drawing that the magazine had reproduced as background art, Bethany's original work, with the coffee shop and the hearts in the windows, and the simple words that had started it all, "Here I exist." The image went viral on social media. Emotional comments multiplied, shares crossed borders, and suddenly, what was a local story from Boston became a symbol of how small gestures of humanity can trigger transformations larger than their protagonists would ever imagine. 6 months later, when the 5th social coffee was inaugurated, this time in New York, Edward and Lucy were side by side on the stage, not only as professional partners, but as a couple who had learned that some stories, even beginning in unlikely ways, deserve the chance of a complete development. Bethany, now a formal student at an art school thanks to the scholarship from the program she herself had inspired, was invited to cut the inaugural ribbon. Beside her, Jimmy proudly held an already grown bean plant in a pot decorated by himself, and on the main wall of the new coffee shop, an enlarged reproduction of Bethany's original drawing reminded everyone who entered of the transformative power of simply seeing the other, of recognizing their existence, of offering a space where each person could say, with conviction, "Here I exist."